You know, I've never felt more kinship with the people of Troy than I did in the moment a furry friend of mine, and by that I mean a friend who is themselves a furry and not one of the squirrels I regularly converse with, recommended I watch Beastars under the pretense of it being a very high quality drama. The anthropomorphic animals are incidental to the quality of the show, he said, his breath growing distressingly heavier by the second. I don't want to copulate with that wolf girl, I promise, he said, the scent of searing flesh beginning to creep up from the patch of skin beneath the crucifix I was pressing into his forehead. There's only one grey wolf I care about anyway, and she's from a completely different television program, with much better CG animation. Yippee-ki-yay, monkey fighters, I'm Aaox and welcome to Zootopia 2, Minecraft High. Beastars, known in Europe as Beastropolis, would be a fairly standard high school anime romance show were it not for the passingly obvious facts that everyone's an anthropomorphic animal, there's a huge societal struggle going on behind the scenes, and the show kicks off with an actual act of murder in the first degree, so I suppose it's a high school rom-com in the same way Mr. Orwell's Animal Farm is a story about the enjoyable day-to-day of your average agricultural worker, but I digress. This isn't Pixar's wonderful world of allegorical social commentary, you see, even if uniquely inclined people still want to have sex with the rabbit. Not to say, of course, that those issues aren't worth addressing, they very much are, but that doesn't seem to be the story Beastars is trying to tell. Instead, it's an intense, atmospheric story about an introverted, shy young man. Young cub? No, alright, I hate that. Trying to find his place in a desperately muddled world where love and vor go hand in hand. It reminds me of nothing so much as a serialized Trix commercial. Silly rabbit turning tricks is for... Hold up. Our protagonist, Legoshi, is a grey wolf attending a boarding school in a society in which carnivores and herbivores must live alongside one another with a fairly clear divide between those who eat meat and those who are themselves meat to be eaten, yada yada. We've all danced this dance before. I suppose in this world the centrists are omnivores then, which makes a certain kind of... This review's gonna make me say vor a lot, huh? The inciting incident occurs on a chilling night where the lanky canid himself tries to bodily consume a small, frightened girl. If this weren't reason enough to root for the vampiric dilettante, he starts to believe he's developed a crush on her as well, and so must deal with the struggle his newfound feelings bring him, whilst also dealing with the perhaps more literal struggle of finding and subduing the individual responsible for murdering a friend of his. Typical high school. How will society react to an interspecies pairing that crosses the vor-based wall? Are Legoshi's feelings born of love or of an animalistic desire to consume? Why do some of my friends think that the animal people are hot when I think they look kind of like uncanny nightmares, which I evidently naively presumed was the intention? I promise I don't mean to keep harping on about it, it's just... At first blush, to me, Cherryton High looks more like the place where the poor bastards whose Animorphs transformations got stuck at the halfway point are sent to save the rest of us from having to gaze upon their wretched, misshapen forms. Speaking honestly, and perhaps to my relative immaturity as both an armchair internet critic and as a whinging little infant, I was entirely ready to dismiss Beastars out of hand as another one of those shows about animal people. You know, a paint-by-numbers carnivores versus herbivores, we aren't so different, you and I, style retelling of Romeo and Juliet / racism parable for those to whom Space Jam might be regarded as some sort of sexual awakening, but Beastars has a lot more going on than that admittedly very bullheaded surface level read, for the most part. I mean, glass houses and all that. Would Beastars exist without Romeo and Juliet? Probably not, but by that same token, would I? I would like to think so. But you can never know for sure. The carnivore-herbivore dichotomy isn't an analogy used to describe another problem here with the writers going, do you get it, as is so often the want for media like this, but rather it is the problem. Beastars throws into the kind of intensity you can only get when you're very literally dealing with genuinely carnivorous intent. Things that would be considered barbaric to us are more easily hand-waved since they're all different species with different diets, so a world in which half the population have the potential to be Hannibal fucking lector isn't particularly strange to them, but it's horrifying for us, which is heavily used to the show's atmospheric benefit. An incredibly effective, intentionally blurred line is drawn between feelings of romantic or erotic attraction and the desire to consume, and the question, is he horny or is he hungry, is a constant through line through the rhetoric of the first season of the show, something that I'm sure a lot of us can relate to. I remember very specifically the scene where Legoshi realizes he has feelings for Haru, and the scene is punctuated with him wiping paint off his face in the same manner one might drool, with a look on his face that suggests love in the same way I love strawberry licorice. The whole series rides on its atmosphere like a bucking bronco. It's moody, it's jazzy, it's dangerous, it's like being mugged in New York City by a furry. But since this is a drama, I find no better option than to take a look at the characters who ceaselessly drama at one another, and the drama who finds himself squarely in the limelight is that magnificent wallflower. Legoshi's character is absolutely fantastic, and honestly, what else could one expect when the two driving influences behind his design are a heroin-addicted Hungarian and a French nutcase? It's certainly not just that I, as a 6'2", generally perpetually scowling, socially awkward introvert whose grim visage causes ordinary people to flee in what can only be described as pure adrenalistic survival instinct, feel a spark of kinship with the character. As we all know, in all aspects but physical, I am Legoshi. He's a vicious-looking carnivore who's also incredibly softly spoken and is so desperately reluctant to follow his violent impulses that it's borderline impossible not to adore him from episode 1 onwards, very much like other fictional gentle giants, Boo Radley, Hodor, and Shaquille O'Neal's monster. It's a common misconception that the monster is called Shaquille O'Neal, but it is in fact the name of his creator. There's another peculiarity about Beastars though, and that is of course the much maligned high school setting, being to anime what the World War II setting was to first-person shooters in the mid to late 2000s. In this metaphor, I suppose the Soviet storming of the Reichstag is analogous to, slipping over and looking up some poor girl's skirt. Now, ordinarily I would rail against the high school setting. I've done it many times in the past, and I'll do it again because it severely limits the kind of stories one can tell, but the more relatable teenage angst, juxtaposed with serious crime drama and the knowledge that half the student body has an irresistible desire to consume the other, gives it a depth and a nuance that I don't feel one can really get from other shows burdened by their high school setting. Would it work just as well, if not better, in a college or an office? Well, yes, probably, but the combination of regular school drama and these flashes of extremely violent, animalistic behavior make the disparity between the two much more jarring. I will say the fact that most of the main cast members are theatre kids is a comedic masterstroke that really gives the whole thing this air of melodrama that I relished, but I'm not sure if that was the intent or not. Deuteragonist Louis really stands out as an exceptionally melodramatic individual until he, pulls out a Glock. It's always the drama kids. Despite the inherent difficulties in trying to balance a school life situation where everyone is moments away from literally being at one another's throats, and your more standard trappings of romance, coupled with that jazzy, almost film noir-esque mystery that is fundamentally the heart of the narrative thrusts of these first two seasons, Beastars does a remarkably good job of ensuring they all feel factored in, although some feel slightly more factored in than others. It has a lot of plot plates to spin, and therefore duly forgets to spin some of them for great swaths of time. Do you want to know how the core mystery of the series is going? Interested in picking up that particular thread concerning that first-degree incident of indulging in an unsavory fetish that kicked off the entire series? Well, unfortunately, you'll have to wait until Season 2 for that to slip drunkenly back into relevance, I'm sorry to say, as for the moment, we're going to enjoy a short, non-sequitur episode about the pride a young hen takes in watching everyone eat her unfertilized eggs, because this setting is a weird one. But hey, you know how this industry works. Sex sells. Bada bing. In the story little Pardon me. In the storied little world of Beastars, we find ourselves dealing with a burgeoning interspecies romance, a Bildungsroman for Legoshi, metaphors for substance abuse, a borderline superhero origin story. We've got gangland drama, comedic subplots, that whole mess about who ate whom. There's a lot of arenas that demand a certain level of development. It's stuffed full enough that it could qualify as deviant art fetishism. Speaking of fetishes, oftentimes in shows with a romantic bent, once the question of if the hapless couple in question will or if they won't has been resolved, the narrative often just calls it a day and shoves off to find another pair of poor lovelorn wretches to and ah about for a season or two, which I always find eminently frustrating. In Beastars, however, once they've established the fact that there is some degree of vague reciprocity in the relationship between Legoshi and Haru, the narrative explores a different avenue without relegating their relationship to the background. Naturally, someone as meek and thoughtful as Legoshi would have trouble properly communicating with the more gregarious Haru, and this is echoed through the show in a believable way whilst also being allowed to take a back seat for the second act of the series. They keep it sidelined without rendering it a non-element. It may not be particularly elegant, but it works. Some plot threads are, of course, given more attention than others. In the second season, government members suggest the individual who discovers the identity of the Devourer is a shoo-in to become the next Beastar, and then the show promptly never talks about Beastars again, except when the title tells us the name of the show we're currently watching. Were I a more cynical man, I might suggest that the author thought of the portmanteau Beastar and didn't give it much more thought than that, but I'm not cynical in the slightest. And I certainly don't critique things on the internet. The entire concept of a Beastar is fairly ridiculous in and of itself, that the government will crawl to a standstill unless a high schooler is elected via popularity contest to drive the entire political platform in a direction of their choosing, and said high schooler is selected only from attendees of a specific prestigious private school. Perhaps the story was based on the life and times of one Mr. David Cameron, a man who himself was an elected official who also engaged in an interspecies relationship by sticking his Johnson into the mouth of a dead pig in a bold proclamation of what he intended to do to the country he would one day govern. You might have noticed that the show's animated in 3D, and you might have noticed also that I hadn't mentioned that it's a 3D animated show until the first half of this very sentence. That's because it's extremely well done, as one might expect from Studio Orange, the people behind Land of the Lustrous. Watching Beastars, you don't really think about the fact that it's a CG show, which is probably the best thing you could say about a show that is entirely CG. Not since the original Shrek has CG so perfect existed. In a medium riddled with jarring 3D CG interspliced with traditional animation, Orange is the exception to the rule and has made a show animated using these techniques where everything looks natural and, better still, incredibly high quality. I suppose the secret to a good CG series at the end of the day is just to have everything be CG and, also have an incredibly skilled animation team, but that's ancillary. Especially notable about the presentation of Beastars, and something that distinctly, perhaps overwhelmingly, contributes to the overall tone of the series, is that it prominently utilizes some rather impressive cinematic touches. Frequent use of split screens, tracking shots, camera dollies, all sorts of camera movement and lighting effects that would have taken a very long time to replicate traditionally, but are much more achievable when done in 3D CG, as opposed to having to draw every frame. I suppose more elegantly I could say that these are actual camera movements and effects as opposed to simulated ones. It makes the proceedings all feel much more mature than your average high school drama, and it's a great relief that the maturity present isn't restricted to the visual direction. Beastar's allegorical society isn't surface level at all. It has nuance to spare and doesn't hesitate to explore that nuance. It goes to lengths to show that the divide between the strong, seemingly brutal carnivores and the weak, seemingly delicate herbivores doesn't exclusively hurt the herbivores, it hurts the carnivores too. It presents the obvious fact that these two kinds of creatures can live alongside one another, develop friendships with one another, and that the idea of strong carnivores and weak herbivores is a false dichotomy, and that simplistic reading of this society hurts everyone inside of it, which is precisely what Legoshi works to overcome. His carnivorous nature renders renders him weak, and his affection for herbivores is what makes him strong. But it does also admit that there are going to be accidents inherently due to the innate differences between the herbivores and carnivores, and even unintentional, there is going to be a conflict between the two that will cause problems, but it's nothing that can't be overcome through mutual understanding. It's a lovely message, and delivered sincerely enough that it doesn't come across as preachy, largely because it takes the metaphor so far. It doesn't feel like it directly relates to anything in our society, although as a straight white guy, it's probably not my place to comment on any real-world implications. Beastars is a thrilling, well-produced, stylish series with fantastic visual direction and some of the more charming characters I've had the pleasure of encountering recently, and as such, I feel is absolutely worth anyone's time. It's a group of disparate voices all coming together in harmony, each to their own tune, but all working in concert together to produce something entertaining and engaging, and perhaps, if you wanted to err on the side of pretension, even a bit thought-provoking, whilst never getting stale. It's nuanced, it's freeform, it's a symphony. And that's called jazz.